Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Welcome to Unless, the podcast, inspired by that Dr. Seuss quote from the Lorax that reminds us of the role we can each play in making the world a better place. Join Dr. Hemma Lomax and her guests as they share incredible stories of being moved to decisive action and perseverance, leading to tangible impact at scale. This podcast is a production of Corporate Compliance Insights.
Reminding people who they are and who they want to be and who they see their best selves as in a corporate context, I think is so important because it can be easy, especially in a corporate environment, to be caught up in the dollars, right?
Yeah.
In the, what's the stock price at today? What are the shareholders saying? What does the board want? Which is all, don't get me wrong, it's all important and something you need to consider. But if you can deliver that in a way that's harmonious with who you believe yourself to be, that's a win for everybody. So I think that's what I would say in terms of kind of how to build that story, how to really extend influence at scale, to your point, is reminding people of who the company is at its core and how their values align in the same way.
That's Gwen Lee Hassan, Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at Unisys and host of the Hidden Traffic podcast. I am Dr. Hemma Lomax, and this is Unless the podcast. Our guest today is my friend Gwen Lee Hassan, Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at Unisys. Gwen is also the founder and host of the Hidden Traffic podcast, which is dedicated to educating listeners about the prevalence of human trafficking in modern supply chains and exploring strategies for prevention. I can't wait to share with you some of her thought leadership on systematically combating this wicked problem and much more. Gwen, welcome to Unless the podcast. I am so happy that we get to chat today.
Thanks, Hemma. I am always happy to talk with you. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to be part of the new podcast. It's exciting.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, well, you are the perfect guest, so I can't wait to share all of your wisdom with our listeners. But to start, if I may, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your origin story and maybe get you to share your journey into the field of compliance, and also ask you what inspired you to have a focus on modern slavery and human trafficking.
You bet. So my origin story is weird. And it's one of those, situations where terrible things can turn out to be life-changing, but also wonderful. So I grew up in Wisconsin. I went to the University of Wisconsin for undergrad, graduated with a PR and marketing focus and launched into that work and had zero intention or even thought of going to law school or becoming a lawyer or going into compliance, just nothing. I was working happily in that field. In fact, I had started a master's program in public relations at the University of Illinois when I got a middle of the night phone call that my mother had been involved in a freak accident. She was golfing at a golf tournament, which was a work-sponsored golf tournament. And she was a little younger than I am right now. And the woman who was driving the golf cart had convinced the trained caddy to let her drive. And she had rounded a corner too fast and flipped the cart, and they rolled down an embankment and into the parking lot. And she was literally, no heartbeat at the scene, and they paddled her back and airlifted her out, and years of rehabilitation and treatment. She ultimately survived, but was permanently disabled for the rest of her life with brain damage, a series of strokes, then unable to ever walk, wheelchair bound, needed constant round the clock care. But as a result of that incident, my family got involved in some significant litigation where we ultimately settled out of court with everyone. No actual lawsuit took place, but that is what paid for the round the clock care for her then for the rest of her life. But as part of that, I attended dozens of depositions and I read all kinds of pleadings, and I started to realize that as I worked with the lawyers, first of all, I found it fascinating. And second of all, I really felt called to address what had caused the problem, which was a series of compliance failures. I mean, at the end of the day, it was a work-sponsored outing. So her employer should have maybe had some controls in place to prevent non-trained employees from driving golf carts. There was also alcohol served at the event. So maybe that should have been a control. The 20-year-old caddy was riding shotgun hanging off the bumper, and his weight was part of why the cart flipped. So was there a control in place there? They didn't have anti-rollover technology in the carts that they owned, even though that technology existed at the time. They didn't have handholds. They didn't have seatbelts. So all of these things kind of accumulated and made me think, wow, maybe that's something I could do something about. So went to law school and started practicing. And as part of that was working for a manufacturer who made military vehicles, and they were subject to the DFAR, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. In the mid to late 2000s, 2009, 2010, those rules were revised to require that federal defense contractors had to have a human trafficking prevention program. And I thought, what is that? Why would they need that? I don't understand. What is this about? So started educating myself and learning as much as I could. And by that time, I was married and had children, and my daughter was 11. And I went to attend a session held in Chicago by C.R. Ben, the Chicago Regional Business Ethics Network, at which Matt Friedman was the guest speaker. Mm-hmm. And I know you know who Matt is. Matt, the founder of the Mekong Club, which is an NGO that fights human trafficking. And he told his story about how he ended up in human trafficking prevention. And it involved him doing kind of epidemiological research in the brothels of Calcutta around the spread of the AIDS epidemic at the time, and how he was in one of these brothels when a young girl came up and, clung to his leg and was crying and sobbing and begging to be taken out of the brothel. And he discovered that she had been sold there by a man who had married her in a small village, promising the parents that she was going to be living a life of luxury, and instead took her and dropped her off at this brothel. And the girl that he described was 11.
Right.
And that connection to my own daughter just shook me kind of to my core. And I realized, my gosh, this, if I lived somewhere else, could be happening to my own child. And I can't do nothing, but what can I do? I mean, I'm working as a corporate lawyer for a big, a big manufacturer. I can't go to Calcutta and start fighting trafficking in brothels, but what can I do? And that is how I came to kind of doing this work in the corporate context, trying to find a way to make a difference within corporate America.
That totally resonates with me, and so many moving parts of what you said there. I know you said before there's something about being a compliance professional where we're all called to action. I love that the question that you asked yourself was, what can I do? I want to just underscore that. It just even going back to Matt Friedman, I think he's written a book where the title of the book is Where Were You?
Where were you? Yes, exactly.
Where were you? And that's a quote from one of the victims in one of those places that he works that said, well, I'm not angry at the people that did this to me. I'm angry at people like you. Where were you? Why did you allow this to happen? And so it moves me to hear you say your call to action was a different question, which is what can I do and what will I do? And you're the best example of someone that is moved to action, has some good intentions, and then finds out how to operationalize them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we move on, what a moving story about your mother. And again, often in the hero's journey, and I think of you as one of my compliance heroes, Gwen, there is adversity. There's a shock to the system that makes you ask the question, well, hold on, how was this allowed to happen? And sadly, you've got a front seat. But yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, kind of what am I doing with my life? I mean, it's just suddenly put everything into relief with, geez, I'm studying marketing and public relations. Is that making a difference in the world when things like this are happening? It kind of shook up my whole sort of value system at the same time. So,
yes. And that was the third thing I wanted to touch on before we move on is the fact that you studied marketing and PR. And I don't want to be dismissive of that because, as we'll probably discover we continue this conversation, being a chief compliance officer is many things. It's law, it's compliance and controls, but it is very much marketing and PR as well. So what a beautiful unicorn. I didn't know you had that background, but that explains to me some of the measure of your success. And indeed, just recently you were promoted to chief compliance officer at Unisys. That was an in-house promotion. Yes. So firstly, huge congratulations on that. Well deserved. You definitely belong at the top of our profession, and I'm glad to see that you are continuing to do that at your current company. Let me ask you a question for those of our listeners that might not really understand the compliance profession as much as you and I do. We're deep in it. How does a role like Chief Compliance Officer at a big company, a global company, allow you to have impact at scale? Why is that a good place for someone like you that cares and wants to do something with, meaningful? Why is that
meaningful? Yeah.
Mm.
I kind of think the title is a misnomer, first of all, I'll say, because the focus, when you hear the word compliance, right, you think regulations and you think, I dotting and T crossing. And I really see the role much more as kind of chief value protector with both meanings of the word value. So the values that the company has, the values that our associates have, but then also the value that we bring our shareholders and our stakeholders is something that's worth protecting as well. And I see them as being inextricably connected. You cannot divide the two, because in order to build value for a stakeholder, you have to live according to the values that the company has adopted and is pursuing. So I see my role and the role of all chief compliance officers to be one that is really geared around being a culture bearer, being a standard bearer, creating and modeling culture for the organization as a whole, but then also setting up the right kinds of incentives, the right kinds of controls, the right kind of behavioral interventions to reward culture and to reward compliance and integrity. So it's a little bit of PR. It's a fair amount of marketing, but it also requires a deep knowledge of strategy and a deep understanding of what your company's doing. What are they selling? Where are they selling? Who are they selling to? What's their value to stakeholders? And what are the values that they're operating under?
Right. And I love that you underscore that, because it really is about tapping into the motivations of others and the journey that they want to go on, as opposed to imposing some external journey on them. So I often like to say, we're not going to do too well if we only focus on fear-based motivation. We're going to have to really be interested and curious and be good listeners when it comes to the motivations of those we serve. One thing I think about a lot now because of that is, how are we going to motivate others? And I think a lot about legacy. And so I want to ask you a question I hadn't, planned to ask you now. You obviously, when you ask the question, what can I do? You're thinking about your legacy, right? What are you going to be able to say that you did about these things that matter to you? How does that translate into how you motivate others to operationalize their good intentions? Because there really is a gap sometimes, inadvertently, between what C-suite might say they want to do and what actually happens on the ground. And so, I think human trafficking is a great example of that. Nobody wants to be involved in human trafficking, but then there's some strategy, to your point, in operationalizing your good intentions. So using your own experience, how do you apply that then to others and motivate them to do the right thing and operationalize that at scale?
Well, I think one of the key things to focus on for me anyway so far has been who these leaders are, who the company is as people. For example, I was talking with one of the members of our leadership team earlier this week who was telling me a personal story about some adversity that they had faced in childhood and how they had overcome it, but then kind of more to the point, what that experience continued to provide them now as adults, and how it had shaped their kind of moral code, how it had shaped their viewpoint, how it had shaped their approach to conflict resolution. And so when you learn the people within an organization, you learn what's important to them. And so then when you are coming to them with an ethics and compliance question, an integrity question, even a regulatory compliance question, you know how to frame that in a way that appeals to who at the core they believe themselves to be. Mm-hmm. And you can point out that taking an action A, might be at its core inconsistent with who they want to be and who they say they are. Mm-hmm. And being able to do that in a way that is gentle, direct, authentic, without being preachy, is the art of being a chief compliance and ethics officer, I think. Reminding people who they are and who they want to be and who they see their best selves as, in a corporate context, I think is so important because it can be easy, especially in a corporate environment, to be caught up in the dollars, right?
Yeah.
In the what's the stock price at today? What are the shareholders saying? What does the board want? Which is all, don't get me wrong, it's all important and something you need to consider. But if you can deliver that in a way that's harmonious with who you believe yourself to be, that's a win for everybody. So I think that's what I would say in terms of kind of how to build that story, how to really extend influence at scale, to your point, is reminding people of who the company is at its core and how their values align in the same way.
Oh, I love that so much. I used to work at Disney, and two of my favorite phrases from Disney movies are The Lion King, remember who you are, and Moana, you know who you are, for that
You
exact
know who you are.
reason,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And the combination of those two things, remember who you are, you know who you are, I think they are quite moving, and it does appeal across levels, across generations.
Across
It's very,
cultures,
across
yeah.
culture. Mhm.
Yep.
It's a very human thing. And again, it takes time and radical curiosity and compassion and care to get to that. But it's a beautifully articulated North Star for those of us in chief compliance officer roles, but also beyond that, right? I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I'm going to dig down on the youth because, again, you say it so effortlessly, but you went to an event in Chicago and you heard Matt speak and you said, "What can I do?" But you didn't stop there. Many of us do that. What can I do? And we muse, but we don't do anything. I want to talk about the podcast that you started. But before that, can you talk our listeners through what you did next? So you said, I'm called to action. You remembered who you are and the legacy you want to leave. And then you had to operationalize your intentions. What did you do next when you felt that?
So the first thing I did was I already have the benefit of being a voracious reader. I love to read. I'm constantly deep in multiple books at the same time. And that continues to this day. I have one next to me, as a matter of fact, and another one that's on my desk at home that I'm in the middle of. So I started reading everything I could. I bought Matt's book. I went off, bought other books I could find out about it. I pulled out the DFAR regs and sat down and read through them. I looked at enforcement cases. I actually ended up looking on YouTube for videos about human trafficking coverage because the U.S. press has, at least at that time, was historically pretty far behind. But for example, Al Jazeera had great coverage of human trafficking issues, especially related to federal U.S. government contractors. So there were stories coming out that we weren't hearing here. And I wanted to make sure I was getting perspective from people who were actually on the ground with lived experience. I'm very conscious in general in my life about my own privilege, and the fact that, I am a Caucasian woman gives me a lot of privileges that other people don't have. So I'm always, when I approach an issue or a problem, looking to step out of my privilege and get to people who have lived experience and then listen to them and learn from them and have them teach me things and expand my own knowledge base. So that is where I started. There weren't, at the time, podcasts weren't a thing back in 2009, 2010. So there weren't those to listen to, but I did everything else I could, reading all the sources I could find, listening to all the news or coverage I could find.
And then why a podcast when you did decide to do it? Why did you decide to, what inspired you to start this Hidden Traffic podcast that sheds lights on human trafficking?
Yeah. So that was a full 10 years later, actually. So I had been, by that time, I'd done a bunch of corporate training around this. I was submitting speaking proposals whenever I could to different professional organizations. I did a keynote on human trafficking at Compliance Week one year. I spoke on it at the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics Institute. So I was doing as much as I could at the time and writing articles and trying to get word out wherever I could. But in 2021, the company I was working for got a new CEO and restructured and decided to eliminate a separate compliance function, which was a fascinating decision that I could discuss for hours on end. But my boss, who was our chief compliance officer, and myself, who was kind of functioning as the deputy, and multiple members of our team were all laid off on a Friday afternoon. So I found myself suddenly with a severance package and a lot of time on my hands. So I started thinking, oh, geez, what do I want to do next? How am I going to use my time? I can't job search 40 hours a week and stay sane. I need something else
Right.
that I can do. And so I actually was having multiple conversations with my own personal set of, I like to consider them my own board of directors, people that have been mentors and advisors to me. And I had a conversation with one of them who said, Gwen, you know what you need to do? You need to start a podcast. And I literally laughed. I was like, I don't know how to be a podcast host. What are you talking about? You speak regularly. You're good at speaking. You're a good writer. You've got all the makings of a podcast. So why don't you create one about something that you're passionate about? And I immediately knew that it was human trafficking. So while I had the time, because I did, it took me a full 2 years to find my next role. I did a lot of work in between. I consulted. I was interim chief compliance officer for a couple of different companies. I did some kind of, I don't know, I did some additional teaching. I'm already an adjunct and was at the time for Loyola's University, but I taught some specific risk and compliance courses for a few organizations. I wrote learning content, but in the meantime, I also had enough time to start the podcast, and that is what really drove that. And my first guest, fittingly, was Matt Friedman, which kind of brought it full circle for me. And he's come back again. He's been on my podcast again as a return guest. So it's been a nice full circle story.
That's brilliant. Well, I encourage all our listeners to check out the Hidden Traffic podcast. We'll share the details of that with the resource notes. But look, that also reminds me back to remember who you are, and you know who you are in a moment where maybe your identity gets a bit of a shock when you lose a job. I know lots of people are going through that right now. I myself are going through a transition. It's really good to have sight of who you are independent of the day job. And while this is very much part of your day job, I want to remind our listeners, you're not a chief compliance officer for modern slavery. You cover a lot of areas. And so this really has been a passion project of yours as well. And yes, I didn't think of podcasts either, but it's just a very nice way to meet like-minded people who are on the journey and learn from each other. I think that's one of the things I love about it too. Let me ask you before we move on from the podcast, are there any stories beyond Matt? I know Matt's very insightful, very, very moving, but are there any insights or stories from the podcast that profoundly impacted you as you did that?
Yes, there are a few. So I'm trying to remember the episode number. I'm over 30 episodes now. Towards one of the more recent episodes, I think it was fall of 24, I had the very unique opportunity to talk to somebody with lived experience as a victim of human trafficking. And this is a gentleman who was trying to remember, I don't remember exactly which country it was, but, somewhere in the kind of Asian area. And he had accepted a job that he thought was a lucrative call center job, and instead was trafficked to a scam mill and was held captive. And him walking me through generously, sharing his trauma, which I was really concerned about because I felt almost like I would take the risk of re-victimizing him by having him on the podcast, but he reached out and asked to be on the podcast. So having him walk through his lived experience was just profoundly moving for me on a number of different levels. So first of all, the company I work for now runs call centers around the world. And we're very aware of the risk of people being lured into what they think is, a great call center job that's not our job and that is used as a front. So that hit me there from a business standpoint. From a personal standpoint, I'm a big believer in gratitude and gratitude practice in general. I have a daily gratitude practice. And so it just brought home very quickly kind of how very fortunate I am in so many ways, but to have avoided having been a victim of this kind of a scam, to be in a economic position where I didn't need to take a job sight unseen, where I could support my family without moving to another country to do so, where, especially in the middle of a job search as I was, that I could afford to say no to jobs that didn't seem like a good fit for me, or that would have required me to uproot my children and move somewhere else. And that was very moving to me too, to kind of have brought full frontal face the privilege that I have. Even it kind of balanced out the times where I went into woe is me mode, right? Where I would sit and think, oh, I've been searching for so long and why can't I find the right role? And this is so frustrating. Even in that context, I was so fortunate to be able to be frustrated because it meant that I was taking the time that many people don't have the luxury of taking to find the right fit.
Right.
So that was probably the most moving episode for me, was that one.
I can 100% understand why. Thank goodness for your guest for being able to survive to tell the story and being willing to do that. It is so important to have the storytelling. I'm so grateful that your podcast has allowed that in a safe space, because I think, as you had so humbly said, when you went to that Chicago event, you didn't really understand the scope of this problem, what we were talking about. Isn't slavery a thing of the past? Was a question that's a reasonable one to ask. And, you know, I have young girls as well. I have this idea that we're very grateful for the protection we can provide them. But even in the United States, in the Western world, modern slavery is a problem. Right here in the US, it's not something that's not happening here. It's very much happening here, and people
very much
into the country.
Also, too, that it also gave me kind of a weird experience because it added some compassion to my own history. And by that, I mean, years ago now, it's been almost 9 years, I divorced. And I have been a single person for quite a while now. And as part of that, there was a time in the late 20 teens that a couple of friends of mine convinced me to get on a dating app. And I was like, ugh, I don't think I need to do that. And they were like, no, you do. You definitely should try it. And quickly, somebody on a dating app contacted me, and I was the most amazing woman they have ever met. And I was the most beautiful woman in the world. And I immediately was like, this is feeling inauthentic to me. I mean, the attention might be nice, but no, I can tell something's not right here. And very quickly, the person, after love bombing me for a few weeks, contacted me and said that they had been mugged and their information had been stolen and they had lost their passport and they needed to go to the embassy. And could I send them, a few $1,000s to help them get by until they could get to the embassy and get their documentation restored? So I knew immediately that it was a scam, obviously. Reported them, cut off all contact, and have never been back on a dating app since then. But my point is, this story on the podcast of the survivor gave me a new appreciation for the fact that I had assumed for years the malintent of that person and had carried around a lot of, how dare they try and take advantage of a single woman, and they targeted me and they're an awful person, and, wishing them, horrible things like they deserve to go to jail. And I hope bad karma comes their way. And it suddenly forced me to realize they may have, in fact, been a victim and may have been in a scam mill where they were being forced to scam people lest they be, beaten and physically harmed and tortured and starved, and for failure to meet a quota of the number of people that they could victimize. Like I said, it was profound for me on a number of different levels, but it gave me new compassion for somebody that I previously had viewed as someone who could only be a wrongdoer. So another level there.
Yes, because what you're exposing there is how systematic these problems are. It really isn't just a random lone wolf on the other side of the internet trying to scam you, maybe, but most likely part of a much bigger systematic organized criminal gang or whatever it might be. And I don't know if you probably have to hand the numbers, but the numbers are stark. I know Matt talks about the numbers of people in slavery today. He also said
hundreds of millions of people.
Hundreds of millions. It's not inconsequential. And then to your point, that's the people that are in slavery. And then what are they forced to do? Whether it's scamming people online or building buildings, construction, where because that might have an ongoing effect with it. It's poor quality, on and on and on.
Cleaning hotels and big box stores, cutting hair in forward military bases. Of course, sex trafficking is also a huge component there. Child trafficking, working in mines that are unsafe and unregulated for, gold and tantalum and tungsten. And I mean, you name it, every industry has got some kind of trafficking in it.
Yes, yeah, and it's huge business. But Matt, I remember him saying at one of the events you and I attended in Texas at a compliance conference just last year, he said it would take the cost of 21 days of potato chips to combat the criminal organization.
Mm-hmm.
And that, gosh, now that's a number I'm never going to forget. I'm going to have him on the podcast to explain that as much as he can.
You should,
You need to think about that. And again, if that's true, and however he's calculated that, it does actually seem attainable. And so I want to move now to how, at least in your role, you look at the systematic problem and what you practically do to tackle it in your day job. So
Sure.
Let me ask you this. If we look at compliance and modern slavery, how do we integrate modern slavery prevention into a company's compliance framework?
I think there's a few ways to do that. First of all, most companies don't realize that their sourcing and purchasing practices are increasing the likelihood and or creating kind of the perfect growing environment for human trafficking. So I'll give you an example. If you are the manufacturer of widgets and you buy a part to make your widget from a supplier in a distant country, your contract historically looks something like this. Hi, I, purchaser, want to buy 1,000 widget parts from you, supplier. But if I buy 5,000 parts, then your price is going to drop in half because you're going to give me a volume discount. And if I need 10,000 parts, then you're going to give them to me at the same price. And if I have an emergency and I need you to flex up to 20,000 parts and you don't flex up, then I get to charge you a penalty because you didn't meet my volume demand and you're late in supplying me with those goods. So if you are the supplier, let's assume you're not a large brand name, household name company supplier. You're a small family supplier, even a couple $1 million supplier somewhere. If you get a sudden demand like we did during the pandemic for a huge increase in volume for, say, latex gloves or masks or the medical PPE equipment, shoe covers, the only way that you can meet the volume demand and the very low pricing discounts that are connected with those contracts is to flex up really fast with your employee hours, with your labor. And the best way to find labor that is cheap and flexible and immediate is to traffic it. Mm-hmm. So one of the big things that corporate America can do better is to adopt a shared responsibility model of procurement. And there is, the American Bar Association has a set of model contract clauses for human rights and for kind of socially responsible procurement. And they adopt a model that literally goes something like this. Hi, I am the buyer and I want to buy 100 widgets from you. If I want to flex up to 1,000 widgets from you, we will sit down and negotiate a fair price. Mm-hmm. And we'll set a new delivery timeline that works for both of us. And if there's human trafficking in your supply chain, we'll jointly take responsibility for how to fix that. And we'll work together to root it out. And we'll, as opposed to the kind of traditional, you will indemnify me for everything model, right. It's a shared responsibility model. So I suggest that number one is it's not easy to do, but it's a solid first step in kind of operationalizing a prevention program within a corporate structure. The next thing that I think is really important is educating people, because to your point, most people in America or in Europe, around the world, in more developed countries, are still in the kind of thought process of slavery. What are you talking about? We got rid of slavery in the 1800s. I don't know what is slavery? And they do not understand the extent of the problem, the depth of the problem, and the prevalence. I mean, how often it is occurring right in their own backyard. There's an example here in the U.S. There was a very large, household name hotel company that was using a subcontractor who was using a subcontractor who then hired a subcontractor who was trafficking labor in from other countries to clean the hotel rooms. And they were living in an abandoned shipping container with no electricity, no running water. And they had been trafficked in and would come in the morning and put on their janitorial or their housekeeper outfits and clean rooms and then go back to the shipping container. So that kind of training is key to let people know, hey, this is happening in your backyard, and here's what it looks like, and here's some signs to watch out for, and here's some of the risk factors. And in fact, layered subcontracting is a huge risk factor for human trafficking. So that would be another one I would suggest. And then there's kind of a commitment overall that I think ties in nicely, especially to kind of ES&G programs or corporate sustainability or corporate social responsibility programs around human rights. And the UN has a compact for human rights, excuse me, which many companies are members of. And I think tying in a human trafficking prevention program into the broader context of human trafficking can be a real benefit.
Gwen, that's a really smart framework for us to think about when we're trying to have this impact at scale in corporations. I wanted to ask you, back to our original conversation about how we can be effective as compliance officers and the pushback we might get when we ask a company to pay a bit more money or take a bit more time. But before I do that, you mentioned the awareness piece, and I want just to underline for our listeners, just in case it's not clear, when we're saying human trafficking, we're not talking about people that are willing to work for very, very low or unfair wages. We are talking about people that are being forced to work. And it's, even though you say they work and then they go back to the container, there is no freedom in that journey between the workplace and the sleeping quarters that are unfit and not fit for purpose. This is actually slavery. I want to make it very clear, because the word trafficking maybe sounds like foreign migration, people moving because they want to look for work and support their families. But really, we're talking about unfair debts. You're held in bondage with fake loans that never end. You're not allowed to leave your family. There are places, not just brothels, but places where clothes are made, where entire generations have been locked in these places for decades. And so we're not talking about, shrug. Yes, other people in other countries will be willing to work in those conditions, even if we aren't. This is slavery. This is actual bondage, not some kind of migration. Am I right?
Correct. And they often start as one and turn into the other. Right? Which is, you often end up with people who think they are taking a job that will pay low, but at least some wages. And then they get to the location and realize, number one, all of their identity documents have been taken. So they cannot move or leave. They have no access to outside resources. So they have no cell phones. They have no means of communication. They're often in a place where they are forced to buy the supplies that they do have from a quote unquote company store, where things are marked up 400%, 500%, 600%, so that they can never afford to leave. Oftentimes they arrive for a job and are then told afterwards, oh, by the way, you owe me for your airfare, and you owe me for your room and board, and you owe me for your visa expenses, and you owe me the fee that I had to pay the recruiter to bring you here. And we're going to charge you 25% interest on that money until you pay me back. So they literally are in debt bondage because the amount of money they are paid is so low that they can never pay back enough to even pay the interest on the, quote unquote loan that's not actually a loan. It is a form of bondage. It is a way to keep them in place. In really severe cases, many of these people have then ended up with threats by the employer against family members at home.
Right.
We're going to assault your sister. We're going to take your family home. We're going to beat up your father. We're going to send a local loan shark to steal all of the jewelry from your family's home. And real actionable threats that if you don't continue to work here, we will harm your loved ones. So it is, make no mistake, this is not, oh, I'm willing to work for a little because I'm an illegal, immigrant or don't have some kind of status that I would need to work in whatever country I am in. This is forcible, often use of physical violence, stealing of documents, debt bondage, forced labor.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier, we're not just talking about adults here, we are talking about children as well. Child labor is a massive problem. Again, many of those children grow up in bondage and end up being adults in bondage and having more children in bondage. So it really is a wicked problem that we're trying to address. Back to the corporations, obviously, it's easy to say, gosh, how wicked this problem is. Any corporation that's contributing to this should be shut down. But that's just not how it works, right? As you said, there are things that companies can do. It still feels very remote, despite the fact that it's on our doorstep. It feels very remote. And oftentimes, even with your 3 steps that you outlined, we can get pushback internally on whether or not we really are part of this chain. Is it really in our supply chain? Is it really us? Again, we don't intend this. How could we possibly be doing anything wrong here? So what kind of challenges, what common challenges that companies face when they identify and address human trafficking within their own supply chains, when they're trying to figure out what they can do better?
Probably the biggest challenge I have encountered is actually tracing their supply chain. You would be surprised at the number of corporations who do not know the supply chain of their supply chain.
Right.
So by that, I mean, they're ordering a widget that says made in Mexico, and they think, oh, okay, it's coming from Mexico. We're good. There's no trafficking there. We're fine. But when you track back to where did the metal come from that widget? Where was it shipped to? How was it shipped? Was it shipped on a boat that uses forced labor? Was it, packaged by people that are in forced labor? Was it a number of steps in the modern supply chain is huge. In some cases, dozens of steps between suppliers and contractors and subcontractors and shippers and customs agents and clearance brokers and, in-country transportation. And the reality is when people try to map out that supply chain, it feels very overwhelming. There's some good technology out now, a number of pieces that are coming out that will help with that. But it becomes very daunting because those systems are also not cheap.
Right.
So then you get pushback on why should we spend the money for this? This is a lot of money. I don't think that we have the exposure here that you think we do. So the approach that I've used for a couple of companies that I've spoken to about this, including the one where I am now, is the idea of taking a risk-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
So if you buy, 5 widgets a year, I don't suggest that you figure out what your full supply chain is for those 5 widgets. If you're buying 5 million widgets, then maybe you devote the money and the time and the resources to track all the way back to source. Where are these, pieces of metal coming out of the ground? How are they being smelted? How are they being refined? How are they being shipped? How are they getting to you? So cost is always a pushback. The counter to that is not only to go back to our original point, who are we as a company? What do we value? Who are you as a person? What's important to you? But kind of on the broader scale, what will the reputational damage to this company be if we end up being caught up in a supply chain issue that relates to human trafficking? Do you want to be one of the companies that's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or goes viral if you're preferring to use TikTok or social media for having a connection to human trafficking? And more, there have been a number of cases of people who are discovered to be in trafficking because they have recorded themselves and their conditions and have gotten them out to a family member who takes them to media, who then publishes them. Right. So while dollars are always a pushback, you can also use dollars to combat the pushback, right? And to say, hey, listen, look what happened to the share price of this company when they had a human trafficking issue. Look at what happened to this company when they were on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And then you can risk adjust that for your company and say, hey, I'm not suggesting that will happen to us, but I'm saying we should look and we should take our top 10, products that we buy, or our top 10% of the suppliers with our company spend, or look at the geographies where we know we have the most risk. And let's look at the top 3 products in each of those geographies. There's a measured risk-based approach that immediately can return value in terms of reduced reputational risk, reduced regulatory risk, that really makes a dollars and cents. In the other word of the
exactly and common sense, and as you say, back to the PR piece, I mean, the reputational risk can be huge. Regulators are always in the background, but social media is right in front of us. Right, so doesn't it take hours for consumer activism when that happens? But again, with that, even pausing on the fear-based motivation, back to your point, who do you want to be? Who are you? What does your corporation stand for? I like to say it's either not my problem or not on my watch. And of course, we want people to be not on my watch.
Yeah.
What's reasonable, of course. I mean, they're not in the business of breaking down organized crime at the same time. They are in the business of profiting from that. If that's the case, there's definitely some work to be done there. And I love the risk-based approach. I think it's really important. When I'm working as a corporate compliance officer, I see what might be coming down the line when it comes to regulation. This is clearly on the mind of regulators around the world. One of the responses is to put questionnaires throughout the supply chain. And we know that those are well-intended measures and proposals. Also, those can be hacked, right? The criminals are always one or two steps ahead of us. So obviously questionnaires, the fact that you ask the questions is good. The fact that you don't care about how the answers are put together is problematic. We also know you can send auditors in, but also you can all imagine the idea of when the auditors come in, everything's shiny and everyone's been told what to say. And so not only the technology, but we're having to get strategic and smart about making sure our compliance processes are effective and not so burdensome that they get abandoned altogether. So any thoughts about that? How can we balance the need for these thorough compliance measures with the complexity of global supply chains and the fact that the system that is human trafficking and modern slavery is big and advanced? And as you said, just with corruption, you can use a few intermediaries and think you're putting the problem away from you. The same thing is happening when it comes to modern slavery. Put a few intermediaries
Absolutely.
in the middle. That's actually part of the system. That's part of the trick. Yeah.
Well, first of all, to your point, there's some really good examples of this kind of thing happening. To protect the guilty, will not name the company, but I used to work with a company years ago who had a very refined due diligence questionnaire process, and it applied to all of the dealers and distributors that were used for that company. And I had a salesperson come up to me at a meeting one day and say, you realize that they just send those to me and I complete them. And I said, wait, I'm sorry, what? Yeah, the questionnaires that you send out to the prospective distributor about have they ever been convicted of a corruption issue, have they send those to me and I complete them for them and put in all the right answers, and then we send it back to them so they can send it to you. Let's talk about frustrating, but it was a good lesson for me that you put together the world's most beautiful questionnaire and you're not going to necessarily get reliable information. Similarly, we've now seen a couple of different firms that have been sanctioned for conducting diligence in certain countries, and bars put on members of their company staff from entry into certain countries because of their due diligence activities. So it makes it very difficult, right, for a company to figure out, well, what am I supposed to do? I can ask them all the questions and they, falsify the answers. I send an auditor in and they are blocked from entering into the country. There's also another famous case of a company who had used an outside social auditor and they received an A+ on their audit report. Fantastic. The UK's Channel 4 went in and did an undercover investigation with cameras, found trafficking rife throughout their organization. The same audit firm went in, gave them a D the next year. So, I fail to understand how it could go from an A+ to a D in a year unless there was something else going on there. So you're right. A lot of the controls that we think of aren't working and they're not effective, and they can, they can be end run around. I think the answer to that, and I know this will sound biased because I work for a technology company, but I think the answer to that truly is technology. We are seeing more and more kind of work in the AI space, work in mobile app space. Right. There are a few different companies now who have anti-trafficking technology that they can launch directly to workers on a factory floor to assess, using geolocation, how many hours are they in that plant? Are they being allowed to leave? Are they going home at night, or are they staying in the same spot? There is use of kind of deep technology by another company that is mapping beneficial ownership back through to companies that you would not have expected to have connections to, for example, Uyghur forced labor. And they have created these extensive ownership maps of companies and how they connect back through shell companies and fronting organizations to, in fact, organized crime organizations. So I think the answer here is increasingly going to be use of technology to get at where the risk really is and where the controls are being violated.
I love that, Gwen. It's very exciting, isn't it, to be in this moment in history. I say from Hamilton, how lucky we are to be alive right now, where, there is rightfully pushback on things that aren't working well, but together we can do these hard things well. And, with some innovation, with leveraging existing technology and future technology, we can rise to the challenge and combat the engine, the machine that is the criminal organization of modern slavery. I wanted to quickly mention just yesterday, the EU put out an omnibus simplification package of their legislation that applies in part to modern slavery, child labor. They had put out, I think in May 2024, the CSDDD, the Corporate Due Diligence Directive, Triple D, had passed. And now the simplification package is dialing back some of those things. And, there may be some panic. Hold on, do they not care about slavery anymore? But I think, again, talk about opportunity. This is a moment where we're in a moment in time, in the Western world at least, where businesses have had enough of things that don't work, are too costly and don't make sense. And so maybe, again, I'm not deep in the details, but maybe this is a good moment to say, okay, let's step back a second. We all agree this is a problem. We all want to help. We just don't agree on the how. And to your point, let's get together and think of what resources we have to make the how more effective and keep one step ahead. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. Any thoughts on what's happening politically when it comes to the burden on corporations when it comes to dealing with human rights in the supply chain?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I'm very conflicted here, which is I understand, especially working for a corporation, that there's a perception among many, especially American companies, that there has been too much regulation historically, and it's regulation that seems pointless or doesn't work. For example, I'll throw out there the conflict minerals legislation that came out in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. There was, of course, an immediate requirement that everybody trace back to source the minerals that are primary in conflict zones, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you were supposed to be able to track where they come out of the ground, who takes them out of the ground, where they are smelted, where they are refined, where they are shipped. We now know, of course, that you can go to the Democratic Republic of Congo and buy a barcode off the street on the black market that you can attach to any bag of anything and say that it is coming from a clean mine. We also know that a number of places that were once operating these, especially child labor mines for gold and tungsten and tantalum and tin, decided, okay, well, if you're going to regulate us that closely, we'll move to another business, and have moved into gun smuggling and drug trafficking. And so the response from business has been, why do I have to spend all of this money to track all of this product back to the source when it's not fixing anything? It's being circumvented. There are workarounds. There's black market tags. So I understand that perspective very much so. On the other hand, I will say, with a complete absence of legislation, you're providing no real carrot or stick for the corporation to be motivated from a dollars and cents and stakeholder standpoint to do something about the problem. Even if it's a small step, if everybody took a small step, we'd be further down the road. So I really applaud laws like the CSR Triple D, because it's a start. It may not be perfect. Right. It may not be fail safe or foolproof, but it is kind of establishing a new expectation level of what it means to do business ethically, at least within the EU, which is we expect you to understand your supply chain. Right. I do think that some of the dial backs that we're seeing, at least initially, make sense, especially for smaller companies, because the resources can be really exhaustive in terms of not only time and energy, but money outlay to get the technology needed to do the mapping that you need can be prohibitive. So I don't think the goal is to drive people out of business. The goal is to make sure that they're doing business the right way. And I really hope that the US, Latin America, Australia, Asia catch up to the EU, the CSR triple D, and eventually adopt similar legislation in their countries, because it's really leading the way right now, and everyone else is sort of behind. So,
Yes. Let me ask you a little bit about our role as advocates then, because you're right. Part of the discourse right now is the question of anti-competitive and profit. That's the priority, as opposed to what we said, that kind of legacy, remember who you are, reputation piece. So as an in-house advocate for leadership, or at least give advice to our listeners who might want to be an advocate in this space, having heard you, what strategies can you employ to foster a culture of ethical awareness and responsibility in these organizations?
Well, I think the first thing that I will suggest is figuring out what matters to your company. And I suggest that the way to do that is by listening. I think a lot of corporate compliance officers, well-meaning corporate compliance officers, come in to a company full of ideas about what people should be doing, or the way things should be, and have a lot to say. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but until you can understand what the company is saying to you, what its pain points are, what its concerns are, what its needs are, what its strategy is, what its executives are staying up at night worrying about, can you really figure out how to advocate for what's best for the corporation? You have to understand the company's priorities and how you, as a compliance professional, fit into those priorities. And then there's a real art to me to building demand. And by that, I mean listening and then communicating effectively with the people and playing the long game, which is, you can't go in assuming that everything you want to get done is going to be done this month or even this year, but building demand for value. If you start with a smaller program and show the value that it brought back to the company, show the dollars saved, the hours saved, the turnover saved, the investigations avoided, the litigation avoided, you build credibility with the company, and you are able to show the real value that you return to the corporation. So then when you come to them with your next project, you've built a track record for bringing value and protecting value. And they're much more likely to listen when you want to suggest expanding a human trafficking program or creating a human trafficking training program. So my suggestion is, if you have a vision for where you want your organization to be, it should be a multi-year plan that is a step-by-step build, a slow build. Play the long game. Get in there strategically. Figure out how the things that you think the company should value fit into their strategy. Look at the behavioral changes that you can make that will be complementary to what you're trying to achieve. Look at the policies that already exist and see if you can embed into one a new topic that you really think is important. Avoid recreating the wheel and coming in and imposing onto people. Build into what they're already passionate about, and you'll be far more successful.
Brilliant, strategic, practical advice, Gwen. And not just for the in-house corporate compliance officer, but for any of us that fancy ourselves as people that can change the world based on our vision of what moves us. Like it will apply in schools, it will apply in communities, it will apply in church, it will apply across organizations politically. So I think very, very wise sage words. This has been a very rich hour. I don't really want it to stop. And I think we're going to have you back, because you do a lot more than modern slavery. I know this. But let me ask you, Gwen, just maybe for your parting reflections for our listeners, and maybe, one tip that you would give to anyone listening that is moved to action. What's one thing they can do today to do their part when it comes to this problem, this wicked problem? And again, any parting reflections you've got?
I'd say the first thing is to educate yourself. Learn as much as you can, not to self-promote too much, but listen to the podcast. It covers kind of nuts to bolts all the different aspects and areas and industries and the NGOs that are working in this space, the lawyers that are working in this space. It's a good primer on kind of the scope of the problem, the different aspects of the problem. But learn first is always my advice. Figure out the different kind of areas that you might be interested in. You might learn more about the NGOs that are working in the space and think, I'd love to volunteer time with an NGO. Or, hey, maybe my company wants to partner with an NGO, and maybe I want to donate money to an NGO, or maybe I want to start teaching about this, or maybe I want to create a podcast about it. Who knows? But until you understand things well, you won't know where your passion aligns in terms of fixing. And that doesn't apply just to human trafficking, but to anything. I think my advice always is to learn first, listen first, and then align your passion and your bliss, as it were, with an aspect of it where you think you can make a difference.
Beautiful. Thank you, Gwen, for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. I'm again so moved and so practical. And you don't have to be Gwen to achieve a lot, right? Like Gwen is amazing. As the story you told, you just have to want to care. This podcast is called Unless because of the Dr. Seuss quote. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And what a perfect description of you and your experiences. So thank you, Gwen. To my listeners, we encourage you to explore the Hidden Traffic podcast. I've listened to it. It's exactly what Gwen says. It's a masterclass for anyone wanting to understand the problem or what they can do. And I say together we can do hard things well. Gwen brings in people that can help with this. So she gives you the community, the ecosystem that is working together to figure out those hard things. And one request from me, please don't forget to subscribe to Unless the Podcast on your favorite podcast platform. We also have a new YouTube channel, so you'll see us in video there. And there'll be lots more conversations on making a meaningful impact. Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you, Hemma. It's been a pleasure.